The summer air on the set of The Young Lions carried the illusion of glamour, but beneath it pulsed danger, exhaustion, and pressure, the kind Hollywood preferred not to acknowledge, and Dean Martin felt it long before anyone else did, standing just off camera as the scene unfolded with military precision until suddenly it didn't, until a stunt meant to look violent became violently real. When a man named Dave, a veteran stunt performer whose name would never appear above the title, was thrown from a speeding jeep just a fraction of a second too late, his body striking the dirt with a sound that didn't belong in a movie, a sound that cut through dialogue, explosions, and shouted cues, a sound that told Dean something had gone terribly wrong, because Dave didn't roll, didn't flinch, didn't move, and while the camera kept turning and assistants waited for instructions, Dean watched blood begin to darken the ground beneath him and understood instantly that this wasn't a bad take. It was a broken man, and in that frozen moment, the machinery of Hollywood hesitated, unsure whether a life outweighed the cost of daylight and schedule. And Dean Martin, the effortless crooner, the smiling star, stepped out of his role and into something far more dangerous, pushing past crew members, kneeling beside Dave, checking for a pulse that felt terrifyingly faint, as producers barked about resets and angles, and when the medic arrived too slowly for Dean's liking and the producer muttered about delays as if a man bleeding out was nothing more than a logistical inconvenience. Something inside Dean hardened, his voice cutting through the noise with authority no script had given him, demanding an ambulance now, not later, not after one more shot. And when he was told this was part of the job, that the man had signed up for risk, Dean snapped back that no one signs up to be discarded, not today, not ever. And as tempers flared and money was cited like scripture, another figure stepped forward from the edge of the set. Marlon Brando, watching closely, silently, until he spoke just 4 words that shifted the balance of power entirely. "I'm with him." And suddenly the stars weren't performing for the studio. They were standing against it, the cameras forgotten, the crew holding their breath as Dean made it clear he would walk, and not alone, that every electrician, grip, and cameraman behind him would follow. And faced with the collapse of a multi-million-dollar production, the producer finally caved, the ambulance called, the shoot halted, and as Dave was loaded onto the stretcher, the atmosphere changed forever, because everyone there understood what had just happened, that a line had been crossed and then drawn again by a man who refused to let humanity be edited out of the frame. And though the studio would quietly punish Dean later, pulling offers, cooling relationships, marking him as difficult, the story spread anyway. Not in headlines, but in whispered reverence among the people who built movies with their hands and their bodies. And Dave survived, his medical bills covered, his family spared ruin, his future redirected because one star refused to look away. And when filming resumed, nothing felt the same. The crew working not just for a paycheck, but for a man who had proven that decency still had a place in an industry ruled by profit. And years later, when the legends were told, this wasn't the story of box office numbers or awards. It was the story passed down quietly about the day Dean Martin stopped a movie, stared down the system, and reminded Hollywood that behind every spectacle is a human life, and that sometimes the most heroic performance is the one that never makes it onto the screen. What followed in the days after the ambulance doors closed was quieter but far more revealing, because Hollywood had a long memory and an even longer reach. And while the studio publicly smoothed things over, privately the tone shifted toward punishment disguised as professionalism. Phone calls stopped coming as quickly, meetings were postponed indefinitely. Projects Dean had been softly promised began evaporating without explanation, and no one needed to spell it out for him because he understood the rules of the town well enough to know that defiance always came with a price. Yet what surprised him most wasn't the retaliation, but the silence. the way executives avoided his eyes on the lot, the way conversations ended abruptly when he entered a room, as if integrity were contagious and they feared catching it. But beyond the studio walls, something else was happening, something the accountants couldn't measure, because grips talked to grips, stuntmen talked to drivers, assistants talked to camera operators, and the story spread the only way truth ever really does in Hollywood, through the people who carried cables, built sets, and took hits so stars could shine, and every retelling sharpened the moment when Dean refused to move, when Brando backed him, when a man's life became more important than a shot list. And that story began to change how people carried themselves on sets long after the young lions wrapped. Because suddenly stuntmen spoke up more often, medics were called faster, and producers thought twice before dismissing injuries as collateral damage. All because one star had shown that power could be used to protect instead of exploit. And Dave, recovering slowly from injuries that ended his days of falling from vehicles and buildings, never forgot the sound of Dean's voice cutting through the chaos, a voice that told him he mattered, that he wasn't disposable. And years later, when Dave transitioned into coordinating stunts, he carried that moment with him, designing safer sequences, refusing unnecessary risks, reminding younger performers that no paycheck was worth a life. And Dean watched all of this from a distance, never claiming credit, never giving interviews about it. Because that was never the point. He had acted on instinct. The same instinct that told him right from wrong long before studios and contracts complicated the difference. And when Marlon Brando later told him that what he'd done took more courage than any role either of them would ever play, Dean brushed it off with a shrug and a quiet joke. But the truth lingered between them, unspoken and undeniable, that on that Paris set the mask had slipped and revealed the man beneath the myth. Not the singer, not the heartthrob, not the Rat Pack icon, but a human being unwilling to step over another human being for the sake of a schedule. And as years passed and Hollywood reinvented itself again and again, the story remained, surviving because it wasn't useful, it wasn't promotional, and it didn't serve the machine. It served memory, and memory has a way of preserving what matters most. So when people later spoke of Dean Martin, they talked about the voice, the charm, the effortless cool. But among those who really knew the industry, among those who had stood on dusty sets and dangerous locations, there was always an added sentence, spoken a little more softly, about the day he stopped a movie cold, about the day a star chose conscience over compliance, and in that moment redefined what strength looked like in a world built on illusion, proving that sometimes the most lasting legacy isn't found in film reels or box office records, but in the quiet knowledge that when it counted, someone stood up, drew a line, and refused to let humanity be edited out of the story. In the days that followed, the set moved again, but the spell had been broken. Because once you see the machinery of power hesitate in the face of conscience, you can never unsee it. And Dean Martin felt that shift everywhere he went, in the colder handshakes, the conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the offers that suddenly weren't right anymore. Hollywood's quiet way of reminding you who really owned the town, yet none of it shook him the way the image of Dave lying motionless in the dirt had, because Dean knew something the studio bosses didn't understand, that reputations recover but choices don't. And word traveled fast through the back channels of the industry, not through gossip columns or publicity offices, but through lunch trucks, sound stages, and late-night bars where crews gathered after brutal days. And there the story grew, not exaggerated but sharpened, about how Dean Martin, of all people, had drawn a line in the sand and refused to step back. And that knowledge changed how people worked around him, how stuntmen took risks knowing someone was watching, how grips pushed carts and electricians climbed rigs believing their lives weren't invisible. And Marlon Brando never forgot it either, carrying a quiet respect for Dean that went deeper than professional rivalry. Because rebellion was easy when it served ego, but rare when it served someone with nothing to give back. And Dave, rebuilding his life piece by piece, never spoke loudly about what happened. But he didn't have to, because every paycheck that didn't vanish into hospital bills, every year he lived to see his family grow older, carried the weight of that moment, and decades later when people spoke of Dean Martin, they still talked about the voice, the charm, the Rat Pack swagger. But among those who knew, among those who worked in the shadows, he was remembered for something else entirely. For the day he proved that being a star didn't mean standing above others, it meant standing beside them, even when the cost was real, even when the cameras were still rolling, and that was the legacy no studio could erase. The quiet truth that long after the lights dimmed and the films aged, one man's refusal to look away had changed the rules. If only for a moment, and sometimes a moment is enough.